How real do you think these calls are for Joe Biden to be replaced?
So I think two things can be true at the same time, right? There's the reality. I like to think of it as the reality of how some Democrats are feeling after seeing that debate performance last night, which was not good, right? He did get progressively better over the course of the debate, but it started low. The bar was low. And then he was a totally different person at the watch party after. And I was watching like, well, where was this Joe Biden on the debate stage? So it's the reality of how some Democrats are feeling. And those are mostly, from what I have gathered, these are elected officials, right, who have, especially House Dems, people who are on the ballot this cycle, operatives who have advised campaigns. And then there's also the reality of the situation. And the reality of the situation is what the campaign is speaking to. The campaign, I asked them directly, I said, is Joe Biden dropping out? I called and they said no. I called up to the convention folks today. I said, are you all prepping for a new nominee? They said, we are not.
But let me ask you this, because you know these folks. And they were obviously concerned enough that at midnight last night, your old boss, the vice president of the United States, came on our air, right? And she acknowledged, wasn't
I think, what did she say? It was a slow start, but a strong finish. I heard. I said, oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned the House Dems. I mean, Joe Biden, people who know him will tell you, genuine patriot, cares about, and actually did run because he cares about the future of the country. Is the Senate imperiled if he stays on the ballot? Is the House imperiled? And maybe are there people who are involved in that who are worried about what this means down ballot?
So what I have heard,
because it's not just about him, right?
It's not just about him. I heard, look, last night there were House Democrats, particularly frontliners, again, folks who are in some of the most vulnerable and competitive districts who are Democrats this cycle, and then the new Dems. They all had their own individual meetings to get together amongst themselves to figure out what they would like to say to the campaign and what they think to talk.
So this was a big enough deal. The
debate performance was, it was not a good debate performance. And so in a debate where folks are coming in to say, look, you're going to see the contrast between the two candidates, the contrast on the performance side was Joe Biden didn't seem to be there with the performance. Yes, he got better over the course of the night, but the contrast wasn't what folks were expecting, and that's what I heard from Democrats. And so there are House Democrats. You have to remember, for folks at home, every single member of the House of Representatives is up for re-election. Right. Democrats are defending 23 seats this cycle in the United States Senate. There are also 11 governors that will be chosen, new governors, North Carolina being one of them, hence why Joe Biden is in North Carolina today. And in a lot of those down-ballot races, these candidates are running ahead of the president. And so what I heard from frontline members last night and some of the new Dems and people and some senior Democratic leadership is that, hey, we want to preserve our numbers. The best scenario for Democrats, particularly in the House this cycle, is in fact that the House Democrats continue to keep their numbers where they are. So if they're looking at this debate performance, they want to know, one, what is the campaign going to do? They thought that they did not hear enough forward future conversation. They heard a lot from the president in the beginning of the debate about the past. And what I heard in the first commercial break, because the members was on the phone, Chris, they were like, hey, I said, well, what do you think? We don't think he's talking enough about the future. The campaign, when I asked them about that, they said, hey, towards the end of the debate, he did. This is why what the voters think matters here, because the voter reaction is going to be very, I think, slightly different, which we've seen from these focus groups already, from people who were watching it. And I'm interested to see what people over the course of the next couple of days say. It's going to be different from some of the campaign professionals, right? The elected officials who know better, who have been keyed in, who knew what to expect from Joe Biden. Some of these voters are like, everybody seemed old. I've also heard reaction that said, well, some people didn't answer the questions. Joe Biden seemed a little flummoxed, but I'm still with them. There are other folks, like that focus group, though, that we just saw from Gotti, who said, it was an oh, no, and an oh.
Yeah. Did the number of double haters grow last night, and will they stay home? Will they go to a third-party candidate? Let me get you in here, Governor Kasich, because, look, you said weeks ago you would not be surprised if Joe Biden didn't end up being the nominee. Tell me what you see happening next in the real world. It's easy in the aftermath of something like this for everybody to get worked up and for a lot of things to be said. But I saw you on the campaign trail in the midst of chaos, often like a voice of reason. Give us the voice of reason. What do you see?
Well, first of all, I stand by the comments I made several weeks ago. People, who were on air with me thought, I was coming out
crazy. Yep.
Field, Well, it turns out to be true. Look, I've talked to some very prominent Democrats today. They're now, it's a two-step process. One is they don't think that Joe Biden ought to stay. They think that he needs to step away. They want to praise him for what he's done and who he is, but they don't think he can carry the torch. Secondly, then the question gets to be, well, then who takes his place? And that's a matter of who's going to have the, who's going to have the standing, who's going to fit where people can say, oh, yeah, I sort of know that person. I respect that person. I think they could step in. And that will happen only if Joe Biden is able to bless that person, whoever it might be. If Biden decides he's not going to leave, he's going to stay and take this to the very end, they're not going to take him out. I mean, this has to be something. And look, what's happening is there are a group of Democrats who are meeting and talking and deciding who can approach the staff, who can approach him to let him know that they don't think that he can do this. The problem last night was that a lot of people who saw this thought, he's not up to it. I mean, a good man, but he's just not up to this. And this for me is not a happy day. This is a sad day for our country to see what the heck happened last night. And I appreciate what Simone is saying. I've been kind of calling this out for a long time. I can't even believe they decided to do that debate. I don't even understand what they were thinking, because he's had so much trouble with this kind of a situation. Look, I think that the Democrats are now gathering. I know that they are. They're senior members that are talking and trying to figure out next step.
Let me ask you this. Can I ask you this?
Yes.
Because, again, I think in the aftermath, a lot of people would say, take a breath. I think some people said on our air, take a breath. The Trump campaign, a lot of folks thought it was done with the Access Hollywood tape. That would have been very late, right, to replace a nominee. John Fetterman, near fatal stroke. Difficult debate, to say the least. Was still having difficulty communicating. Both of them were elected. Is this different? I mean, we live in this 15-minute, and that may be an exaggeration, news cycle where people move on to the next thing. Maybe, who knows, after the 4th of July, this is old news. This is history. People saying, did that actually just happen last month?
Yeah, I don't think so in this case. And look, I'm talking to Democrats. I'm not talking to Republicans today about what's happened. I had a number of friends that I served with, got along with a lot of Democrats, and didn't always agree with them, but I had good relations. They're in panic mode. There's just not two ways to think about it. Look at the New York Times today. Tom Friedman coming out and saying he needs to step aside. Christoph. I mean, the media is beginning to say he has to go. I don't know how they get past this moment. And look, I feel terrible for everybody involved here.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.